Thank you. Welcome to Media Apocalypse, which is a series of interviews with scholars and thinkers about the crisis affecting journalism today. In particular, we focus on these shrinking sources of funding for reliable journalism that can inform the public. My name is Scott Shapiro, and I teach at Yale Law School, and I will be the moderator today. We are joined, as usual, by RonNell Andersen-Jones, who is the lead Teitelbaum professor of law at the University of Utah, Jack Balkin, Knights Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment, my colleague at Yale Law School, and another one of my colleagues, Sandy Barron, famed media attorney and visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, where we teach a legal clinic together, providing pro bono legal services to documentary filmmakers. But we are very fortunate today to have as our guest Rasmus Nielsen, who is the professor of political communications and director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. His work focuses on changes in the news media, political communication, and the role of digital technologies in both. And he's done extensive research on American politics, journalism, and various forms of activism, and a significant amount of comparative work in Western Europe and beyond, which brings us to our topic today, which is about the public funding for media. Our first guest in the series, episode 1 of Media Apocalypse, was Victor Picard at the Annenberg School, who argued that the United States needs to provide a robust public option if it's to reverse much of the carnage of the media apocalypse, which is only accelerated because of the COVID pandemic, which got us thinking about how America stacks up to other developed democracies. And Professor Nielsen wrote a very important report in 2011 with Gerd Lindenbach, and it was entitled Public Support for the Media. And the report reviews similarities and differences in public sector support for the media across 6 developed democracies: Finland, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and the US. So I was wondering, Professor Nielsen, if you might just walk us through a bit of the different funding models that you found across these 6 democracies?
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, it's important to recognize that in all these countries, for-profit private publishers account for the vast majority of investment in original reporting. This is particularly important at the local level, but also at the national level, where both sort of specialist niche publications as well as most upmarket newspapers are incredibly central engines of journalistic production. And take the case of the UK, for example, which is home to one of the most well-known public service media organizations in the world, in the case of the BBC, and also has other forms of indirect support like tax exemptions for publishers. Even in a case like the UK, with the sort of relatively well-funded public service media provision, about 2/3 of all investment in original journalism comes from private sector for-profit publishers, overwhelmingly newspapers in particular. So what are the models that exist across mostly Europe, though there are countries outside of Europe who have versions of this too? I think we can sort of break it down into sort of 3 main types. The first type, and this is the one that I think is sort of most well known, though often misunderstood outside of Europe, is public service media, often in practice public service broadcasters. These are large organizations that are independent of the government of the day, normally in practice state-owned, though the exact legal construction can vary from country to country, with their own governance structure, and funded in whole or in part on the basis normally of some sort of license fee, which normally is tied to whether you own equipment that can receive the broadcast signal of the public service provider. So in the UK, for example, every household pays effectively a poll tax of about 155 UK pounds every year to fund the BBC as a public service provider. And this generates in turn about sort of 3.7 billion pounds for informing, educating, entertaining the entire British public. Now, this model is very central to public support for journalism as part of the public service mission in much of Europe. It's, I think, rightly admired we know from research that the presence of genuine, independent, and relatively well-funded public service media deliver not only a significantly more informed public, but also a significantly more equally informed public than systems that rely entirely on the private sector and some non-profit supplements. That said, I think it is worth recognizing sort of two complications of the model, if you will, that I don't think takes away from the fundamental value of it, but are very real and I think sometimes perhaps overlooked by people who admire it from a distance. One is that public service media are basically based on a regressive poll tax where everyone pays the same no matter what their level of income is. And people might accept the social contract around this when everyone uses the service more or less the same. But in a world in which these organizations often in practice remain public service broadcasters as they were originally, even as the public is moving to digital and mobile and platform-dominated media, it becomes increasingly problematic because the reality is that many of these organizations are taking money from everybody and giving it to old, relatively affluent people who watch a lot of TV and listen to a lot of radio. So I think there is one issue there, is around how does this model adopt to a changing media environment. The other one is that a lot of organizations call themselves public service broadcasters, but some of them probably ought to be described as state broadcasters. Not all of them are equally genuinely independent of the government and of the parliamentary majority of the country in which they operate. And I think it's just really, really important to recognize that there is a gray zone, and at the sort of darker end of that gray zone, I think there are countries in which one can legitimately wonder whether these organizations are in fact a net boon for public life or whether they are in fact detract from public life. So that is the first that we describe in the report. And this is one, of course, with about 100 years or so of history in many parts of Europe. The second part is one that exists at the state level in some states in the United States too, though I think it's often sort of overlooked, and which is indirect support for private sector for-profit publishers through VAT exemptions, which effectively is a form of indirect subsidy where the taxpayer or the tax authorities forego revenue to encourage businesses that are deemed to have a sort of a public purpose. This may seem boring, but actually it's an incredibly significant form of subsidy in many parts of Europe, where this is in the tunes of hundreds of millions of euros of foregone tax revenue that is an indirect subsidy for an industry that then in turn, of course, is able to invest more in professional journalism than they would otherwise. This system has a great advantage, which is that it's extremely simple to administer once you know who you classify as a publisher and what you classify as a news publication. It's basically automatic, more or less. It also has the great advantage that it is a general subsidy that allows for no point at which politicians or civil servants or other interested parties can make judgment calls as to who merits support and who does not. So you sort of take politics out of the day-to-day administration of it and minimize the risk that this can be used for media capture, which of course is always a real risk, as much of this will be sort of public interest journalism. These are sort of great advantages of the system. There are, of course, also some possible shortcomings to the system. One is that it essentially rewards success. So there is a risk that you essentially disproportionately reward those publishers who build profitable businesses on the basis of serving what can often be well-served publics in advance. Is it a good use of Treasury money to make sure that someone like myself, an Oxford professor on a comfortable salary, can get cheaper and more news than I would otherwise? If the system doesn't also serve a wider public who may be poorly served with news, whether these are minorities or local areas or underprivileged communities, then there is a risk again of sort of a socially regressive system that I think is one can sort of question whether this is reasonable. The other is that these subsidies have often been in practice tied to print specifically, and it's been quite hard often to sort of roll them over to a digital environment, because the technical definition of what exactly constitutes a VAT exempt publication gets curiously precise when you read the legislation. So in the UK, for example, for a long time, it was a certain number of folded but not bound pages that were stapled, but not glued. And you can sort of start to wonder, well, what does that look like if it's a news app? So that's the second type. And again, it's incredibly boring in some ways, but it's a very, very significant subsidy. at considerable cost to the tax authorities, and that makes a very real and meaningful difference in terms of the sustainability of the industry.
May I ask a question? So one of the things that you had mentioned in your 2011 report, which was that there was very little across all the countries. There was very little, in actually 5 out of 6, no pure digital play subsidies. Has that changed since 2011?
It has changed. It has changed in some countries. I mean, and this just very briefly on the third type of subsidy we describe in the report, which is direct subsidies to private for-profit publishers, where you directly channel taxpayer money to for-profit private companies in recognition that they also deliver a public service. These are rare, I should add. They exist in some of the Nordic countries, and they exist in France and Italy in different ways, and a few other countries. And they are often quite sort of complicated to administer, because you have to make judgment calls as to who get the money, which of course introduce the risk that judgment will be colored in part with whether the people making the decisions like the editorial or not. And they also, I think, sometimes have a risk of essentially propping up powerful incumbents, potentially at the expense of newcomers, as we documented in the 2011 report. Some of this can just be policy drift. You have old arrangements, the world changes. Some of it can be a result of sort of rent seeking or regulatory capture by incumbents, which is, of course, a real issue as well. When we wrote the report in 2011, there was almost no earmarked support for digital-only journalism. All of this was tied up with legacy forms of distribution like print, and in some countries broadcasting. That has changed in some countries. I think the most important example of this is Denmark. I happen to be from Denmark myself, but this is just an accident, where the direct subsidy that was offered before was tied to print distribution. So you subsidized the distribution of print newspapers from the observation this would increase diversity at the national level. Say the communist newspaper or the Christian conservative newspaper was unlikely to be able to serve the whole country if they had to pay the full cost of distribution to reach outside of the Copenhagen area. But of course, over time, this became effectively a print subsidy rather than a news subsidy. This has been changed since with the political decision makers and the civil servants making the observation in a conversation many of us were a part of for years, that the real bottleneck in news is no longer the cost of distribution, but the cost of production. So in Denmark, this has been converted to a production subsidy, where every publisher that are part of the self-regulatory press council, which is recognized in statute but is an independent self-regulator, can apply for a subsidy that is proportional to the level of editorial investment they make. So you subsidize the investment in original journalism rather than the distribution of dead trees. But this is a rare example, and it's still, I think, the case that these regimes, as promising as they are in some ways and as valuable as they can be in many ways, are often in part by accident and path dependency, and perhaps sometimes also in part because of lobbying pressure, tend to privilege incumbent legacy companies while making few concessions to the particular needs of new entrants.
Before I turn this over to my colleagues, I just one question, which is, do you know if the levels have stayed the same in real terms in of this public subsidy for either public broadcasting or private media outlets?
It's really different from country to country. If I were to make a generalization across Europe, I would say that the levels of support have gone down for two reasons. One is that there's been a lot of political criticism of public service media and attempts to reduce the spending on them as part of general austerity measures, but also perhaps out of political discontent and lack of support for them, in particular on the right. Though some countries are different, like Germany, where there is a sort of constitutional guarantee of some of this that sort of helps keep the value up. But generally, there's been cuts, including in the UK for the BBC. And in terms of the indirect and direct subsidies, because they were often tied to legacy products like print, they have declined as the legacy product declined itself. And there's been, in the countries I know of, with the exception of Denmark, there's been no meaningful attempt to reorient the system in a way that kept the real value up at where it was in the past.
I see. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over to Sandy. Go ahead, Sandy.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you, Rasmus. That was a really interesting and valuable explanation of various forms of subsidies that I know that you have studied. The question is having looked at this and looked at it now well over a decade, we in the U.S., and looked at the U.S. too, thank you, we in the U.S. are looking at a serious set of issues, particularly focused on the lack or the diminishment of local, serious journalism, including watchdog journalism that I know you focus to some degree in your reports. Sitting here today and knowing what you know about these various interventions by governments, what would you suggest should be our priorities, or would be the best of interventions that we should be looking at most seriously in 2020?
Thanks, Sandy. I mean, it'll sound like I'm trying to dodge the question when I start by saying that generally I don't seek a sort of prescriptive role of telling politicians or governments what they should do, but I always try to help people understand the likely consequences of the options that they are considering. I have a personal view as a citizen, which is that I believe passionately in the public purpose and public value of independent professional journalism. And I think there is a very clear case intellectually that there is market failure and that we are not seeing the level of provision that a democratic society would benefit from at the local level in terms of underserving many communities that have frankly been very poorly served by the mainstream press for a long time and continue to be so today. So in that sense, I personally think there is a strong case for some form of public support. And I think we need to just sort of recognize that if policymakers pretend that there are no ways of doing this, that's demonstrably untrue. There is proof of concept of ways in which this can be done in a way that meaningfully supports the provision of independent journalism and the diversity of independent journalism without introducing the kinds of problems of market distortion or media capture that many rightly worry about. So I think this can be done, and my personal view is it probably should be done. What I would say is that I think the situation in the United States illustrates how important it is to think about what you want to do within the reality of the political context in which you are. And the position that I personally sort of hold on these matters is that I think media policy can be very enabling for independent professional journalism, provided that there is broad-based political support for it and broad-based public support for it. If policies are pushed through that command only a slim majority, either in the legislature or in the public, it will make independent journalism even more of a political football than it already is. And I think that's quite dangerous both for the profession and for the business, where a stable regulatory environment, I think, is much sought after. And I question whether the United States has that broad-based public and political support. And for people who think it has, I would just encourage them to go door to door in, say, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and ask people how much more money they want to pay in taxes for journalists, rather than it going to other things they value, or perhaps staying in their own pocket. I personally would be happy to, but is there public and political support for this in the US? I wonder. And the second observation I would make, and this is perhaps sort of somewhat less urgent in the US, though not entirely unurgent, if you will, is that, in countries in which there may not be sort of full support for and respect of the freedom of the media, I think media policy can very quickly become a tool with which powerful politicians try to control news media or punish news media. And again, I think it's clear that the United States is not where some members of the European Union, in particular in parts of Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean area, are in this space. But I would also say that there are clearly some American politicians who don't regard independent journalism as a public good, and I think would probably be delighted to have more means with which to clubber them if such means were provided. And I think we just have to be realistic that media policy is going to be developed, passed, and enforced, not by the politicians that each of us might want individually, but by the actually existing politicians that we have in our respective countries.
That's a pretty pessimistic on some level.
I think we're on our own. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, and I say there's no particular joy. I mean, I think media policy can make a very positive difference. I think we see proof of this in some countries. Fundamentally, in most of the world, I think it's up to journalists and publishers to find a way ahead. Because I'm not convinced that the political class is filled with sort of benign intentions towards independent professional journalism. I think the reality is that most politicians, I think, are somewhere in between sort of benign indifference over sort of rank hypocrisy towards outright hostility towards independent journalism. And in terms of the public, I mean, the truth of the matter is that even though I regret this and don't share this view, much of the public doesn't trust journalism, and much of the public doesn't value journalism. And I think many people would question whether their tax money should go to journalism as much as I might want it individually to be the case. So sorry to cut you off like that, but I think we have to be realistic about this, and I'm not super optimistic about the prospect of sort of large-scale political change in this space in much of the world.
I will turn it over to my other colleagues. If there's time, I'd like to come back and talk about regulatory issues that you also discuss in your most recent report. But back to you, Scott.
Okay, sure. If we have time, we'll definitely come back to that. RonNell?
Yeah, Rasmus, thanks for being with us. I think this is all really helpful. I wanted to ask you a question about a model that you didn't mention that we've sometimes discussed as a group, and that's the possibility of journalism as a nonprofit or charitable enterprise. It seems like the nonprofit news sector is larger in the US than it is in the EU, but it also seems like there's some sense, here at least, that some of the work that's funded in this way is maybe hard to replicate in other models, including things like deep investigative journalism or data journalism or intensive fact-checking organizations, all functions that are democracy enhancing and fulfill, I think, a deep public need. Can you talk to us a bit, just both about why it is, if it's true, that so little charitable funding flows to journalism in Europe, and more broadly, whether you see this as a useful, sustainable, appropriate model in the US and elsewhere?
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think this is a really important opportunity just to recognize what a valuable addition I think that nonprofit journalism has been in the US for a long time through the important work done by NPR and PBS affiliates at the local level, often very small broadcasters with very limited resources doing incredibly important work in their communities, but also through newer editions like the Texas Tribune and ProPublica, now the 19th, for example, which I think is a really interesting and exciting addition to the nonprofit ecology in the United States. I would sort of, and I think in particular, it's really encouraging to think of this as sort of, in some ways, a really new way of delivering on some timeless ambitions of journalism in different forms, and a new way that can, I think, do away with one of the things that bedevils many other models that we know, which is that the truth of the matter is, in both public service media and certainly in private sector media, it's a very small part of revenues overall that go into journalism. I mean, the majority goes into other things. And if you look at many nonprofits, in that sense, from a public interest return on investment point of view, you get more bang for your buck with these organizations. And I think it's really encouraging to see some of the important work they've done. That said, I would say, I think in the United States, and even strong proponents of the nonprofit model, I think would normally recognize this, it's an important addition. It's not a model at this stage that has shown that it can generate or ever will generate the volume, variety, and geographical spread of coverage that for-profit media, with their many imperfections, and they are very real, have generated historically. So, we all know the numbers. I mean, I think the number, from memory, the number of newsroom employees in American newspapers have declined from something like 70,000 to something like 30,000. I don't see any world in which the nonprofit sector in any way can ever hope to make up for that kind of decline. That doesn't mean newspapers were perfect, but they were really, really important editorial muscles, in particular at the local level, where this has been hard to do for many nonprofits. So I think really important, but ultimately I think we need to sort of recognize that this is sort of an addition rather than a full-scale sort of replacement, if you will. Why is it different in Europe? Because it is very different in Europe. I mean, I would sort of point to probably sort of two main things. One of them is one where I know that a lot of people who are looking at media policy in Europe are looking to the US for inspiration, which is just that it's much harder to register a news organization as a nonprofit in many parts of Europe because they're not recognized as public interest organizations, and they're often seen as political, which of course complicates things in many, many ways. And I think we can learn a lot from the United States in this respect. So that's one thing. It's just the regulatory environment is a bit different. The same goes for tax deductions, which I think are generally more generous in the United States for donations, which I think help explain why charitable giving per capita is often a lot lower in many European countries than in the United States. And the second part is then what is the nature of charity in Europe is, from the research I've seen in this area, this is not our own work, but charitable giving, I think in Europe has been historically more focused on sort of education, health, welfare, and sort of culture, if you will. And there isn't really the sort of the track record that comes with the NPR and PBS systems in the United States of sort of a half century plus of philanthropic support for nonprofits. So I know many people who are building up really impressive things like the Bureau for Investigative Journalism here in the UK, but they have to sort of do quite a lot of sort of priming on the ground with potential donors and funders just to sort of bring them around to the idea that you could think of journalism as a nonprofit a project and as something that would merit philanthropic support either from foundations or individuals. I'm hopeful we'll see some improvement in that area and some growth, and there are some really impressive examples of this. But at this stage, I think the environment in Europe is not as hospitable for that as it is in the US, and I hope that we will see some policy reform to encourage it, but by following American examples.
RonNell, would you just, you have a little more time.
Okay, yeah, I want to try to tie some of the things we've been talking about from your 2011 report to the November 2019 report on independent professional journalism and advancing it. And I really love the construct you have there about thinking about the three component parts of freedom, funding, and a future. That is that we have to first protect journalists' sort of core freedom of expression, and then provide for this sustainable business model for news, and then make sure that they're oriented towards digital, mobile platform-focused futures that sort of reflect actual media consumption habits rather than sort of old legacy media models. And I have sort of a two-part question that I think relates to that in thinking about that sort of three-pronged approach here in the US. And the first, I guess, is if we think about the US, we have arguably put all of our eggs in that first basket, right? Our sort of regulatory focus has been entirely on freedom and starkly less about policy or governmental concern for funding. And I wonder whether you think that there is reason to believe that we are now so radically deficient in funding and in thinking about funding models that really no amount of freedom will save our democracy unless sustainability now takes center stage. And then related to that, I wonder if you could just give us some more concrete insights into something that you mentioned a little earlier about the interrelationship between the last two of those, that is the funding and the sort of future forward-looking path. And one concern that we have tussled with a lot in our previous conversations as a group is this question about how subsidies for private sector news providers, whether indirect or direct or general or targeted, might risk propping up those who are already in the field, who are working in outdated, unsustainable business models, and do so at the expense of these new entrants, rewarding big monopolistic players or journalism that has really failed to adapt in the way that your sort of future focus describes. And I just wonder what thoughts you have on how those two goals can successfully mesh, and really like what specific backstops need to be enmeshed in our policy thinking here in order to avoid that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, that's rich. I mean, I want to be clear. First of all, I don't think these are sort of substitutes, and I think you're hitting it exactly right. Freedom, I think, is a necessary precondition of independent professional journalism as we value it. But of course, freedom in itself does not guarantee a sustainable business that can in turn, power professional work. So it's clear the United States is an extreme outlier in the world of sort of broadly speaking liberal democracies in its very curious sort of 20th century deviation from, of course, as I'm sure Victor has discussed with you, a very long history of very generous support, in fact, through postal subsidies and other forms of support from the federal government for a thriving media sector that was private but benefited from all these forms of support, to then this sort of strange, barren 20th century with very limited, if any, meaningful support, at least from the federal government, and also very limited from state governments often. So I think the U.S. is an outlier here, and if broad-based political and public support could be generated for it, then perhaps this might be one of those cases where the United States could perhaps learn a thing or two that it might want to replicate from other countries, just as we learn so many things from the United States. In terms of the future, I mean, the risk is real. Let's be clear about that, and it's something I'm very concerned with. You know, I don't think that that there is a strong case for sort of propping up, you know, the media consumption habits of already quite well-served, older, often affluent audiences, and I think it's a real risk. Always is rent-seeking and regulatory capture of various sorts. But I want to be very clear that there are, you know, models in place, and I mentioned the one from Denmark as to how one can deliver platform-neutral forms of support that meaningfully enables a sustainable private business of investing in independent professional news. You know, does that mean that all new things are you know, better than all bad things? You know, that's for each of us to answer for ourselves, as long as the system doesn't discriminate against new entrants in favor of old ones. I might personally feel there is a greater case for taxpayer support for the Amsterdam News than for Breitbart, even though, you know, one is an old newspaper and the other one is a new entrant, but that's my subjective positions. I think the critical point from a policy point of view is that you don't put into place a system that only supports print and never supports digital only. And as said, I think we can see examples of that being done, like the ones in Denmark. And it's essentially, I think, a question of political will. Whether such models are adopted elsewhere. Are they transformative? I think they make a big difference, but again, I think it's important to sort of just pause for a minute and recognize the details, which is that even in the case like Denmark, which, you know, is in many ways sort of a fairy tale outlier in the global picture, and is in this way too, you know, a country with a very long tradition of sort of proud social democracy and a sort of conservative / right-wing political tendency that probably would be sort of close to communism by US standards. So a sort of very different right-wing, if you will. Even in that environment, which has been incredibly supportive, broad-based of support for independent media, both public service and private sector media, in the private sector, the combined value of the indirect and direct subsidies are something in the region of 5 to 7% of industry revenues. So this is not something that keeps, you know, the entire industry afloat, and arguably it shouldn't be, because that would, I think, would create a very severe risk of, you know, forms of journalism that were more oriented towards the subsidy regime than towards serving the public that journalism ultimately both lives for and of.
Jack?
I wanted to drill down, Rasmus, a little bit more into some of the points you were making in response to RonNell. Politically, direct subsidies are much more salient and much more likely to get pushback than indirect subsidies. For example, tax expenditures, tax breaks and such, which is why, of course, in the United States, lots of things are done through the tax code instead of through direct subsidy. But this leads me to the puzzle that I wanted you to help me with. How do we subsidize digital news production in a way that's different than the subsidization of any other digital enterprise? So we might ask, you know, what are the fixed costs in a digital system as opposed to a newspaper? Newspaper, you know, you have to get the printers, you get the printers union, you get the delivery trucks, all that looks like fixed costs. And then what are the variable costs? When I think about what the key costs are in digital news production, they seem to be primarily hardware, but that's not a lot, and then it's mostly salaries. Right, and then the question is, what differentiates a digital news production system from any other digital business, which is pretty much in the same situation? That is to say, they have an investment in hardware, but mostly it's salaries. And so that I'm puzzled as to how you would engage in subsidies. Certainly from the standpoint of taxes, it's very puzzling how to do it. And then the other possibility would be that you have direct subsidy, but that's politically much more salient, more likely to produce pushback, and also requires that you decide in direct subsidies as opposed to indirect subsidies what's a news organization, as opposed to an organization that produces content, but it's not a news organization. So can you help me out thinking about how to do that from the standpoint of policy?
I mean, I think you've hit, as all of you have in the various issues that you raise, on one of the sort of complexities of this. You know, I'm all for just saying, you know, we should do this. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. That's a matter of personal opinion. I happen to share that at a personal level. The truth of the matter is that that's the hard part comes next, which is, you know, what exactly are we supposed to do? Why? On what basis? How do we sort of build broad support for it, and how do we, you know, develop it in practice in a way that doesn't open up to all sorts of abuse or just impossible to administer? I mean, in some ways, again, I mean, I would turn to the case of Denmark because it's one of the countries that have sort of dealt with this and tried to sort of, you know, tackle those questions and find practical ways forward that so far have worked and worked in ways that the European Commission has recognized as being compliant with the state aid rules, for example, and held up as an example for others to follow should they wish to. In terms of the indirect subsidies, I mean, the game changer, and this has actually just happened in the UK too, in Denmark, was when finally it was the VAT exemptions were extended to digital news products rather than being you know, only for print. It doesn't sort of entirely do away with the sort of various challenges you described, but it really made a very big difference because you ended up, you stopped subsidizing the past at the expense of the future, and you gave news publishers incentives to invest in digital news subscription models, which they built up.
I just want to interrupt and ask to explain. Yep. So if we have a VAT break for digital news, what that means is it's for stuff that's free, it doesn't matter, but for things where people subscribe, yep. So if you subscribe to a particular paper, it's now cheaper. And that's the idea. That's how it's supposed to work. Yes, exactly right.
Exactly right.
Keep going.
Yeah, so that was one thing that happened. Now, of course, that doesn't in itself answer your fundamental question, which is who can receive these subsidies? What exactly is a news publisher? And if one operated at the individual level rather than the organization level, who exactly is a journalist? Now, I'm not familiar with the sort of the details of how this exactly operates in the US, and I wouldn't want to dabble in amateurism, in particular, not in a conversation with the four of you. But I think in Europe, in practice, the question of who is a journalist has been sort of kicked to the corner with the Council of Europe's functional definition of practices of journalism rather than the status or role as a journalist, which has a long tradition in the way in which Europe has thought about press freedom in particular and freedom of expression. So that's quite an expansive but also quite an amorphous definition. So individual journalists are not the object of these policies, it's news publishers. So that turns to the second question, who exactly is a news publisher? Right. The way in which it's often been sort of operationalized in Europe is that it's been tied in with forms of self-regulation that are recognized in statute. So for example, in Denmark, you know, if you join the press council, you have recourse to sort of a complaint system that can essentially sort of minimize your legal costs of sort of day-to-day complaints. And in return, you accept being bound by decisions by a council where the majority of members are not from the publishing industry, but are independent judges and the civil society representatives. And this is concerned with news publishing. Now, this means that you have a very a handy list of who are recognized as news publishers and also accepted not just the privileges, but also duties that come with that.
I'm going to stop you right there, because in translating that into the American context, it's like the recognition of a guild, which might have both public and private members in it, and which would be able to impose obligations as well as subsidies. You can see how some American writers would find that distasteful, because they would want to be on the outside looking in, and they wouldn't be captured.
I mean, I think that's a real issue, but I mean, I think every policy will always have gray zones like this, and I suppose that's both why it's so interesting and so hard. And I think we just need to be clear that no, there is no sort of frictionless way of doing this. But this is one part of it. Just to finish the sort of, there is a backstop on this in Denmark too, which is that it's not left entirely to this sort of self-regulatory body to determine it. There is sort of a description in the legislation that provides the basis for the direct subsidy, that defines in a few relatively general sentences what is meant by news as being reported information on matters of public interest for a general audience. And that appears regularly. I can't exactly the sort of the verbatim definition of it, but sort of a relatively broad definition of news that I think would be sort of recognizable both for individual members of the public as well as for journalists, that provide a pretty clear basis for saying, well, you know, if you're a book publisher, you're not a news publisher. But also if you're the publisher of lifestyle magazines or gardening magazines and the like, you know, you're not really within scope for this.
Yeah, this struck me as something that was going to present a serious problem, both in the American context, but more generally in the context of digital businesses that just don't believe in boundaries. They just, whatever boundaries currently existed, they just basically undermine them. But the last question I wanted to ask you, because we're running out of time, is this. You earlier mentioned the distinction between elite consumption of news and broad-based consumption of news. That is, you were concerned about government policies that would essentially benefit elite consumption of news, but they wouldn't, in fact, benefit broad-based consumption. Now, there are a couple of things that I was puzzled about here. First, I'm not sure in the digital context what reforms will go in one direction as opposed to another. That is, which reforms make most sense if your goal is to move away from elite consumption subsidy to broad-based consumption subsidy. The second is, and related is, there's a puzzle as to whether, or as to, that's also a change in terms of the content. That is to say, what kind of content are you imagining will be consumed by a broad base of folks that will be different than the consumption by elites? And is it your view that that kind of consumption is going to conduce to superior democratic results? That is to say, there's a whole set of issues, which you're well familiar with, in the history of journalism about this distinction between trying to inform elites and trying to inform the general public, and about the differences in the kind of content that are involved. So could you say a little bit about the problems of subsidization that you've opened up when you make this distinction?
Sure. I mean, I suppose, again, this is largely a sort of a philosophical and political question where different people with different principles will have their own views, and I respect the plurality of views. I'm happy to share my own, which is that the way I would think about it is a simple way to sort of break it down would be, I think there are sort of three sides to this. One is the provision of independent professionally reported news. The second one is the diversity of the provision of independent professionally reported news. And the third one is the reach of independent professionally reported news in the public at large, and in large part the equality, if you will, of that reach. Now, I don't think there is sort of a single policy intervention that can serve to move the needle on all three if people agree that these are sort of three distinct, related but distinct indicators of whether a media system in fact enhances democracy. But I think we can sort of think of a portfolio of policies that can help on each. So on provision, for example, you know, even before the New York Times introduced its paywall, you know, I happen to like it as my own old hometown newspaper. I happen to think quite highly of the New York Times with its imperfections and the sometimes very strange op-eds that it chooses to publish and solicit. But you know, even before it introduced the paywall, a very large number of Americans with internet access never read the New York Times, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. They didn't find it appealing. And more New York Times would help on the production, yes, and it would help people like me who subscribe to it. I would get more of it, you know, without having to pay extra, and that would be good in some ways. And of course, there is a societal benefit that even people who don't read from having power held to account. But in itself, it will not, I think, deliver on the diversity and the provision side of things. So what do you do in diversity? Well, I mean, I think that is something that cannot be solved by a single organization. And really there, I think we need to think about what are forms of support that are, if you will, conducive for diversity of voices rather than just supporting a few big players. And just to return to the example of Denmark, the way in which that's done with the direct subsidies, that they are capped at the top. So the biggest publishers benefit proportionally much less than local publishers and smaller publishers do. So that's a direct intervention to try to increase diversity through a policy design. And then the third one of reach, I think, is probably the one that is hardest to achieve from a policy point of view, in the sense that, unless some people believe that media literacy is someone who will sort of fix this. But I mean, I suppose I would say sort of two things. One is that this is arguably the most important, in my personal view, role that public service media have played in Europe has not just been the provision of more stuff for people like me who are very well served, but that they were uniquely able to reach a much broader and often underserved part of the public with news and content that they wouldn't consume otherwise, at least from commercial players, and the commercial players often didn't produce for them. And that's precisely why I'm so worried about the tendency we're seeing now for public service to retreat, if you will, to an easier to reach and more privileged audience, leaving aside a larger swath of the public, and leading, I think, to increased information inequality if they cannot reverse that course. So I think there is a real issue there around provision. Public service can play a role there. And of course, I think we really need to recognize this. And commercial for-profit journalism historically has been incredibly important for that. In Europe, in the tradition of popular newspapers in particular, but also some commercial broadcasters. And I would say the same in the United States. I mean, the most widely consumed sources of news, are not, upmarket newspapers like the New York Times, or highly partisan cable television networks like Fox News and others. As much as they are remarked upon amongst the chattering classes, the most widely consumed sources of news in America are local for-profit commercial television stations. If we don't recognize that role of breadth, I think we will get, if you will, a digitally supercharged version of the sort of late 18th, early 19th century public sphere, of highly partisan, elite-oriented, incredibly disputatious, news and opinion that is completely out of touch with the vast majority of the public, and serves many parts of the population incredibly poorly, because they don't understand their values and their perspectives and their needs and their desires, and that would sadden me. And I suppose I personally think that this is one of the greatest sort of challenges we face: increased information inequality. And as cautiously optimistic as I am about many parts of the future of journalism, though it faces very real challenges, obviously, both business and many others, editorial and whatnot, is that I sometimes wonder whether the profession is conscious enough about the risk of losing that broad-based public connection with many and diverse communities who often have not seen themselves reflected in journalism, that we look back on. And I think anyone with eyes to see must recognize that what we sometimes, I think, confuse for a golden age in American journalism was journalism by white affluent men, for white affluent men, and about white affluent men. And, that ain't going to cut it in the future. And I think we have to do better than that. And I think that has to be, and that's a very personal opinion, of course, a consideration for those who want to design media policies, not to protect the journalism we had, but to think about an even better journalism we might get in the future.
I'm sorry. This has been so incredibly informative and helpful, and the only thing I regret is that we have to stop, because I know I have, and many of us, we could talk to you forever. So thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. We really are grateful for the time and the insight.
Thank you so much, and to Sandy in particular for organizing all of this, and such an interesting conversation. So thank you so much for having me.